Hello, it's Aaron Wren, and I have a great guest here today to talk about a difficult topic. That is Chris Bolinger. He is the co-author of the men's devotional Daily Strength for Men, which has sold an incredible 400,000 copies. Even if you don't know anything about book sales, you know that's a lot. There's a link to buy it in the show note. He's also the co-host of the Throwing Mountains podcast, where I recently heard him give some very insightful thoughts on Christian men and divorce. So I wanted to ask him on to talk about this topic. It's one I've written on before, and it's one that sadly, all too many men experience. So Chris, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks, Aaron. It's great to be here.
Now, the divorce rates in general have gone down from their peak. It used to be that something like 50% of all marriages ended in divorce. Now it's like 40%, but that's still a lot. And I know there's a lot of debate over exactly how many Christians actually get divorced, but it's certainly not a small number. So there are definitely a lot of Christian men who get divorced for whatever reason. What is different about getting divorced as a Christian man versus getting divorced as like a regular secular guy?
That's a great question, Aaron. We were talking off air before we went live. I got divorced in early 2018, and throughout my career, I was mostly a tech guy. I was a product manager for mostly software companies. I was always very data driven because I discovered in the business world and in general, people don't really care what I think. They care what they think, and they also care about, what's going on in the market or what's going on in their part of the market or their part of the world. So I went looking for data. I was interested, I'm a Christian guy. I was deeply impacted by my divorce. How do other Christian guys get through this? And I guess I wasn't really surprised, but there's next to nothing out there. Nobody does studies. Nobody talks about this. So I've got a lot of anecdotal information from guys I know who've been through a divorce, guys who've contacted me because I've written about this topic for crosswalk.com, which is a Salem online outlet. But the reality is, I don't know a good answer to your question because there's just so little data out there about it. And I don't want to speak anecdotally because I don't think that's really representative of the world specifically and the impact of divorce on Christian men. I will say, though, that from what I've gleaned, there's a huge impact. I think that Christian men have are impacted by it even more than non-Christian men because the church has expectations of men, especially in marriage. And so regardless of why your marriage ended, I think from the typical church's standpoint, you are a failure. You have failed to live up to Ephesians 5. You failed to love your wife as Christ loved the church and to care for her in that way. And so you, for the rest of your life, carry this stigma that I'm a divorced Christian man.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I can say is that it's just one of the best known statistics in all of social science is that women initiate the vast majority of divorces. And, the exact percentage varies by the source you look at, but it's around 70%.
Yep.
And I am something of a student of evangelical marriage material. So I'll read these books and I'll do a lot of analysis of them. And I have never once heard that statistic given in any sermon, in any book on marriage in the church, which is astonishing. Now, a couple people have emailed me. They said, hey, if you look at this in this book on this footnote, it's there. So actually, I actually have some to track down. I'm not saying they never exist, but they're not there. And I found it really interesting. This feminist scholar, Valerie Hobbs, actually published a peer-reviewed study where she analyzed the language used in the teachings on divorce by conservative Christian pastors and found that their language framed divorce as a male-initiated activity, that it's something that men do to women rather than the reverse. So I think I can at least take that one academic study, my own analysis, and the actual facts around it, and see that, in my view, they're really like off base in just how they talk and think about it. So you're kind of getting like a warped perspective to some extent on the reality of marriage. I don't know if that's your. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think there's certainly something there in the way they talk about it. And then again, maybe there's a reason people don't want to do research on it, if you know what I mean.
Well, you said it's a very tough topic at the outset, and it is. Church leaders, pastors, I think, are ill-equipped to discuss this because there are major repercussions if you're a Christian leader and your marriage ends in a divorce. In many denominations, you can no longer hold a position of leadership because the Bible says a man must be the husband of one wife, and it's interpreted to mean that if you ever get a divorce, that you no longer have this standing. You don't meet the requirements to be an elder or a teaching pastor. I think also another reason why this is discussed as male initiated is because that's the way it was 2,000 years ago when Jesus spoke about it. And throughout the history of the Jewish people, women had a very low position in society and they were very dependent on their husbands. And so the law and what Jesus said about divorce was in a context of, men initiate divorce. Women didn't initiate divorce because it was slitting your own throat. I mean, what were you going to do if you were divorced? And so the warnings and the prescriptions against divorce and the only reasons allowed for it in Scripture were all based in that context of a patriarchal society where men had complete control or major control of the marital affairs.
Yeah. I could go on about this, but I really don't want to spend too much time bashing at church. I told you not to let me do that. But I want to talk about how men can respond to this. I want to be productive about it. But before we get there, it does seem that a lot of guys, when you talk to them about their wife divorced them, and it's like they never saw it coming. It came as a big surprise out of the blue. Have you found that there are any kind of warning indicators that men should be looking for prior to getting divorced that can tell them that something is seriously wrong they need to look at? Or
I had the same impression, and I've had the same conversations with guys, and everything I've read says that women do initiate 70% of divorces, and men are often surprised. I think men do know the warning signs. I think that they're aware in many cases that their wife is unhappy. But I do think that in general, men and women view the relationship differently. I think that men, they know there are issues, but they themselves tend to be, I don't want to say satisfied, but they want the marriage to continue. They do, in many cases, do their part, or they believe they do their part to try to improve things. I was surprised. I was looking at the only study I could find of divorce among Christians. It was done by Lifeway Research back in 2015 at the request of Focus on the Family. And a lot of the people who were practicing Christians, they went to church at least once a month, and in most cases they were there every week. So these were what we would consider to be believing Christians, and in many cases these were model Christians. I mean, they were active in church, they were in a small group, which, as you know, in the evangelical church is kind of the holy grail. You don't just come on Sundays, you have to get in a small group. Well, these people were in a small group. They were doing various jobs at the church. They were teaching, they were mentoring, they were involved in a youth group, they were deacons, they were elders. And yet they got divorced. And many of the men, both men and women, but many of the men had actually approached the lead pastor. I think it was half of them, and said, "We've got problems." And about half of them had gotten at least 1 hour of counseling from a church staff member or a recommended counselor that the church had recommended. So I think that men in general, know that there are issues, and they actually are seeking solutions to those issues. Yet they are surprised when the wife pulls the trigger. And I think it's just because there's this, I don't think the men pull the trigger because they've been told all along that this is a really bad thing to do. I mean, it's drilled into their heads, especially in the evangelical church. You do not divorce your wife. You make the marriage work. And I can't speak for women, but I think that women have a different understanding, let's say, and that's why in the end they pull the trigger 7 out of 10 times.
Yeah, it's my impression is that your average man is not as sophisticated on what you may call the EQ, of understanding,
Right.
reading sort of the signals that are what are going on and interpreting them correctly. I think most of the time they should have seen it coming, and if they'd been more aware, that. But again, it's not most of our strong suits, I think, as men. So I really want to hone in on what do you do when it happens to you? In this main scenario in which your wife has divorced you, you're a Christian man. What kind of guidance would you give about what you should expect through this process, what you should do, etc.?
Okay. Well, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that, as we've said, most men are surprised. They knew there were issues, but now the marriage is over. So I think you have to deal with the realities. And then I think you have to look for help, because this is very, very difficult to get through on your own. You are going to be on your own in a lot of ways. More than half the men who get divorced, who are Christian men, leave their church. A lot of times it's because the wife stays. They don't feel comfortable staying, so they leave. But unfortunately, half of the guys who leave their church never go to another church. So they not only have seen their marriage end, but now they're walking away from their faith. Maybe they have a personal faith. I don't want to judge, but they've lost that Christian community and they don't find another one. And that's a really, really bad thing. So you're talking about 1 out of 4 men who go through a divorce end up walking away from the church. So I think that, you're going to grieve. You're going to go through some very hard time. It could be months, it could be years before you fully recover. But in the midst of this suffering that you're going through, don't walk away. Don't walk. Maybe you need to leave your local church, but you need to find another body of believers. You need to find other Christian men who can assist you through this process, because I don't want to say you're not going to make it on your own, but it's very, very difficult to do it all by yourself. And you have to recognize the scope of this. In this study that I looked at, the Lifeway Research Study, these were active Christians. They were typically worshiping with their wife and kids. 2/3 of them had kids under 18 at home. And, within a couple of months before the divorce, they were still in church every Sunday with the wife, with the kids, doing their jobs in church. And then the bomb goes off. And what they found in this study was that not only do men end up, many of them, not going back to church, but in 35% of the cases, at least one of the kids ends up walking away too.
Wow.
And so the impact is profound, and it's far reaching. I mean, this is going to wreak havoc with, not just your immediate family, but your extended family on both sides, with your friends in church. Let's face it, if you're a Christian guy going to church, you've got a wife and kids, you're doing the family thing at church, right? You're in the couple small group, your kids are in, youth group. It's family, family, family. and you're the model family, you're all sitting there in the row, in row 3 every Sunday, and that's not going to happen anymore. And your marriage is over. And so for a lot of men, you've lost a big part of your identity. I mean, you were the Christian husband, you were the Christian father. You're still a Christian father, but now your family's splintered. You may not see your kids all the time. If they're going to church, they may be going with their mom, or maybe you have them on weekends. I mean, everything's topsy-turvy.
Right.
And, your Christian friends, for the most part, were the guys that you saw at church. You probably didn't have a real close relationship with a lot of these guys. They were probably the husbands of your wife's friends for the most part. And, these guys, in many cases, will get a lecture about how they're not supposed to spend time with you anymore because you're a bad influence.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to see your friends, your so-called friends, evaporate. It's going to be rough, but you need to do two things. You need to find another group of Christian men that you can start to get some support and encouragement from, and you need counseling. If you haven't been to counseling before, and I was surprised a lot, like I said, a lot of the guys had gone through counseling, but it may have been, a last-ditch effort to do some marriage counseling because of things going down the drain. You need personal counseling. And a lot of guys are very uncomfortable with this, and they've now left their church, so you can still go to the pastor there, but you're no longer really a member of that church. You're probably looking elsewhere. I would strongly encourage guys to get counseling and to plan to get it for at least a year. You need it.
A couple years ago, I wrote a piece about men, what to do when your wife divorces you. There's a link to that in the show notes, by the way. And it hits on some of those themes you just said. So I was very gratified that happens. This is going to be a process and a long one. I usually guesstimate that for a mature man, it takes about 3 to 5 years, to fully recover. Definitely, a lot of guys don't have a great friend network to begin with because, as you point out, for a lot of men, their quote unquote friends are the husbands of their wives' friends. And then you leave the church, and then your friends, you're probably tough to be a friend to because, you want to kind of complain. You want to you're probably not pleasant to be around. And so people don't want to be around you because that's just like the natural thing. And then, so a lot of guys, find themselves essentially without a great support network, and isolated, which is not good. The one thing that I thought was interesting is you said that men should be in counseling. I always thought, I kind of thought of that as something that would be good to do, but not necessarily required. What makes you say that men should go to therapy, basically?
I don't know how I would have made it through my divorce. I had been seeing a counselor first with my wife for years, kind of in and out, and then on my own for maybe the last 2 years of the marriage, and I kept going well beyond the end of the marriage. So part of this is personal experience, but it's also observing some of my friends and other people that I've talked to. Like you said, men don't have the social networks. They don't have. I mean that in the non-online sense.
Right.
They don't have
real social networks.
They don't have the band of brothers. I mean, we talk about a band of brothers. It's a very common term in the evangelical world. Men don't have a band of brothers. They've got maybe one guy. Mm-hmm. And that guy may be their friend in some other context, and that guy doesn't want to have the entire burden of his friend's divorce foisted on him. So counseling, I think, is just it's a way of having the ability to vent, having the ability to say whatever you want to say in a trusted environment with somebody who is trying to help you get through this and ultimately grow through this process. And I just think there's no substitute for it. Now, I also had the benefit of having been in a very good men's group. It's a ministry called Christ-Led Community, CLC. I was in that for 4 years. And my time in that men's group ended about 7, 8 months before my wife left. So I had an added benefit of having had 3 or 4 years with a group of, it varied, but 6 to 12 guys who had my back. They knew me. I had been vulnerable with them. I had been open and honest with them, not just about the marriage, but about things in general. They knew me as well as any man had ever known me. And so I had those men to turn to as well as my counselor. So I really had doubly reinforced a support network to assist me through this process. And I just can't imagine what it's like to go through this without having both of those, but at a minimum, without having a counselor.
Yeah. And I think typically, I shouldn't say typically, but often men who are, who get divorced, something other bad thing has happened in their life. Like they lost their job because, if you becoming unemployed, like increases your divorce risk by 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So, sadly, it's not uncommon for women to cut their husbands loose if he suffers a reversal of fortune in life. So I've told this story before. My former pastor used to ride around town on like a little Vespa-like scooter. He was hit in a hit-and-run accident, had a traumatic brain injury that left him, permanently disabled. Within a year, his wife shipped him back to his parents, divorced him, and took off with another guy. And so it's like, it's one of those things that like nobody ever talked about that. It's like it was just kind of swept under the rug. But like if any man ever did that, it'd be over. So like I think a lot of times you're already dealing with some other issue in your life, and this just gets compounded on top of it. And that's not the case for everybody. But I think it's very, very often the case. You're having multiple things hitting you at the same time. And as you say, divorce is highly destructive of what social capital you do have because all your friendships and all your networks get ripped apart. And of course, not just for you, but a lot of it, less so for your wife, but probably in the longer term for her as well. Because, if she's single, she's probably not tagging along with all the other married couples to dinners and the things that they do as families. The social worlds bifurcate, yep. I think, in ways people don't fully understand. But as you say, it's difficult. So, again, I'm definitely someone who says, don't be afraid to go to therapy.
Right.
If you're like, don't be too proud or feel like you can't do it. Of course, it costs money. Maybe you can get free counseling from a church. But that's a big one. And again, resolving to hold on to your faith, I think, is important as well. Very, very difficult to do. And as you say, it's consequential for a lot of men to do that.
Yeah, I've joked after my divorce that, when I was married and, raising a family, I didn't hang out with divorced people. I mean, you just don't do it in the church, right? And think about not just divorced people, but single people in a typical church environment. What is there for them? Everything, or 95, 99% of what's going on in the church is quote, family oriented. And that's great. I mean, we want to have strong families. We want to be good parents, want to have healthy marriages. But if you are divorced or if you're single for whatever reason, you are the fifth wheel. What small group do you get in? I read a woman, she's a counselor, and she was talking about her own divorce, and she ended up moving to a different town and trying to get involved in a church there. And she joined a small group, which you're supposed to do. And it was all married couples, and they decided their next study was going to be on marriage. So here's a divorced woman in a small group with a bunch of married people, and they're going to study marriage. I mean, so she got out of there. It's so typical. And it's frustrating for divorced people because this is not like an uncommon issue. You mentioned the numbers there's not a lot of agreement on the numbers. I had a very good source. I don't have it with me, but when I wrote articles for Crosswalk, I found a very good source that looked at evangelicals, Catholics, mainline Protestants, non-Christians, what were the divorce rates currently? And this was a couple of years ago, but it is around 40%. Surprisingly, I mean, evangelical Catholics are a little bit lower, but evangelicals and mainlines are almost identical. So this is the elephant in the room in the evangelical church, right? 4 out of 10 people. And imagine if you had an issue where you didn't say what it was, but you said, 4 out of 10 Christians will make a decision. They'll choose to do something, or they'll be impacted by something that's going to negatively impact their life for years, possibly for the rest of their life. All types of Christians do this, including ones that are the most active in church. They're your church leaders. They're your elders, deacons, teachers, mentors. Churches seem almost powerless to do anything about this. And yet, when it happens, like I said, 1 out of 4 of the men who go through this are going to walk away, not just from the church, but from their faith. So, I mean, if you put it that way, I think churches would say, we have to do something about this. I mean, this is a critical issue. And yet they don't. And I don't want to bash churches, but I think that for men, when you're aware of this, even if you haven't been through a divorce, when you're aware of this and you recognize that so many other men are affected by this, I think it motivates you, or it should motivate you, to want to do something about this. And I think that's where men can take the lead, because in many churches, there's not only very little for divorced people, but there's very little for men. You're just along with the wife for the family events. But what's the men's ministry like in your church? In 90% of churches, there's really nothing there. There's next to nothing there. And in the other 10%, it can be pretty hit or miss. But pastors love it when laymen in the church come forward and say, I'd like to do something with my brothers. I'd like to get something going. I'm happy to be a leader in this area. And men are, and I've experienced this, like I said, in CLC groups. Men were intimidating to me before I got into this. I spent most of my adult life really intimidated by men. I was competitive with men, both in the sports area and in the business world. But in church, I was very intimidated by men. They seemed to have their act together where I did not. I knew I had issues. I was pretty reluctant to admit those to men in the church. And then I got in these men's groups, and it's like, these guys are just like me. And it was obvious to, typical person, but to me, it was a revelation. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm just like everybody else. And when men realize that, I think that they are very open. They're not judgmental. They want to help their brother. And so I think reaching out to men who've been through a divorce or whatever their situation becomes almost second nature to men if they can get a men's ministry going in their church. They're very welcoming. They're very open. They all grow by the sharing of information and the praying and the Bible studies and other things that happen in these environments. So, what should a divorced man do? Well, you should find a church that has a good men's group. They're going to be tough to find, but I think the more that when you seriously look, you will find churches that do a good job here. And then when you become a part of that, then you can assist other men down the road. My wife now, who had been through a divorce as well, when we met and connected, she gave me 2 Corinthians 1 verses 3-5. Actually, yeah, I'll read 3-5. And this became my life verse. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's suffering, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. And that changed my life, because here I am, I'm going through a divorce. I hate it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm frustrated. I'm angry. I want justice, all those things that go through your mind. And yet when I read that, I hear, I'm going through this for a reason, because when I come through on the other side, then I am uniquely equipped to help other men who've been through this. It's like if a woman experiences a miscarriage, she is now uniquely equipped. She's empathetic with another woman who goes through the same thing. And that's what's become of me. And we've got a lot of men floating around out there who've been through this. And I think if we can channel those men to help other men, then we can start to build men up. I mean, encouragement is speaking courage into a man. I think we can encourage men with the comfort that we have received from God and from other men. And we can put men on a new trajectory that's a positive one versus, the dealing with picking up the scraps of your former life.
You hit on some good points in there, because I think there's this real difficulty that people have. If you're a man, and let's assume, you didn't have an affair, you didn't abuse your wife, you didn't go commit a crime, nothing like that. She divorces you for, basically because she's just unhappy. It seems hard for a lot of men, on the one hand, to acknowledge that they were wronged. Because I think a lot of times, especially, as you said, in these churches, the teaching is always, if there's something wrong with your marriage, man, it's your fault. Yep. So the idea that you might have been wronged in some way is, I think, difficult to admit. On the other hand, I mentioned it could take 3 to 5 years to get through this, but some men never get through it. They go down to the valley, but they never get out. That root of bitterness springs up in their life. And, I know people who, years later, and it's not just divorce, some people who got fired from their job years and years and years ago, and they still can't get over it. And so it's like, right. A lot of guys, unfortunately, they go into a ditch and they never get out of it. Yep. How do you balance that to recognize what's happened to you while getting actually through it and coming out the other side without letting bitterness devour your life?
I think the double action, the counseling really helped me to own my own stuff. I'll use stuff instead of what the word that I was going to use. I made mistakes, not just in the marriage, but in general. I need to own my part of it. Mm-hmm. But I also need to forgive things that were not on me, and I need to move on. God does not want us to stay in the past and bitter from the past. We need to move forward in a healthy way. So I think that counseling, not just for me, but for anyone, can really help you with your personal mental health, but also with recognizing the reality of the situation. Because a lot of times, I think you said it earlier, men are pretty oblivious. I mean, they kind of see part of what's going on, but they really don't see the big picture. And so talking it through with especially a trained professional can really help you see the big picture, see your role in it, see another person's role in it, and then, agree to forgive yourself and forgive the other person and move forward. But I think, I can't state enough, you need other men. You need even men that haven't been through a divorce, because like you said, all men have been through something that shakes them to the core. And some have dealt with it and it's strengthened them and they've moved forward and they can help you with your own issues, and some have not, and they can learn from those that have. But men isolate. Men are not familiar with being in groups. And I'm not talking about sitting around and singing Kumbaya and, singing and sharing your feelings in that kind of a context. We have to be men, but men do need to talk to other men. It can be on a golf course. It can be, playing disc golf. It doesn't have to be in a circle in a church building, but you need to be surrounded by other men. It can be one-on-one in a coffee shop, but you need to talk to other men. You need to listen to other men, and you need to draw strength from the wisdom that they have gained through their own experiences.
Yeah, again, another great point in there, I think, is, we can very easily try to prematurely self-diagnose what went wrong
Right.
and think we know what happened. And then, we get some more perspective and we realize, like, oh, actually that may have been true, but there's all this other stuff I wasn't thinking about. I think it actually takes time to get perspective on, like, what kind of happened there. I want to flip it around. Guys who are getting divorced, they need to have other men in their life. To those other men, they're like, yeah, I would like to be there for somebody who's got this going on. What advice would you have for them about how to engage?
Okay, I wrote an article about this for Crosswalk, so I'll try to remember a lot of the point. And I wrote the article in consultation with my counselor because I didn't feel comfortable saying, I'm the expert on this. I'm not, even with all I've been through, I'm still not the master of the interpersonal relationship with other men or with other women for that matter. So some of the things that the counselor told me and that I put in the article were, for starters, you need to be pretty proactive, because a lot of guys, you probably know they need help, but they're not gonna come to you. They have their pride. They're not gonna come to you and beg you to help them out. So you need to proactively contact them in a non-confrontational way, just to let them know that you're there and you're open to meeting with them whenever they want to meet. And it could take weeks or even a couple of months before the guy responds, but be consistent, be persistent in a nice way, and let him know that you'd love to grab coffee with him or something whenever he he's going through a tough time. So contact you whenever he wants. Then when he finally does, and when you have the first conversation, you just need to listen, because we're guys, we want to solve the problem, right? He starts talking and you've got 15 things that you want to tell him to, you can't do that. You just got to be an active listener. You got to listen to the guy. He's probably going to vent about his ex-wife. He's not going to reveal a lot, but you just let him talk, and you may have to do that a couple of times. Eventually, you'll get to the point where he's really starting to have a conversation with you. And that's when you can begin to walk him down a path of starting to recover, and maybe get a couple of other guys involved if you've got trusted friends that would, with the guy's permission, of course. But the key through all of this, and again, the entire process is laid out in the article, is this has to be ironclad confidential. Mm-hmm. And that's what kills a lot of these things. And it's ultimately going to kill this guy if you reveal any of this to your wife or anybody else. Then it's game over, because it's eventually going to get back around that, this guy had a problem with porn, or, whatever it is. And he's not only never going to talk to you again, but he could go down in that ditch that you mentioned and just never come back out. So it's an opportunity, but it's a challenge for you to, help this guy out in that completely confidential environment, and recognize that it's going to take, like you said, it's going to take a long time, but you can have a key role. And I think your role is primarily that of a bridge, because if he's come to you, you may be the only one, and you want to bridge him from you to some other guys. You want to get him involved in a group of men at your church, men that can be trusted. You want to, have him talk to your pastor if you can. So be that bridge, be that strong, solid, non-judgmental bridge in those early months, and you can really help this guy out.
No, that's great stuff. I say, don't be Job's friends. And, it's so easy to become Job's friends, it's like, well, it must be this. You could do this. It's got to be that.
Right.
And it's like, and the truth is you just don't know.
Right.
Right. It's like, say, everybody else's problems always seem so simple when we hear them, but our problems are just very complex. What about churches that want to do a better job? We've got, over 300 people watching right now, by the way. And one of them, Jed, left a comment about apparently his church, it's not exactly clear, has a divorce care class.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentioned this divorce care class was known for seeing many come to Christ through that class. So maybe they had like a support group and people who weren't even Christian came because they needed a support group.
Yeah.
And so that became an opportunity for doing some sort of mission type work. What should churches do? Is that a model, or how should churches think about being better in terms of like providing care, not just letting people off the hook for their for their actions, but keeping them from being one of those 25% who just walk away and never come back.
Right. I have not seen divorce care firsthand, but I have heard that it's a very good program. I think it's a video-based 13-week curriculum where you come, you get some good, encouraging information. I think most churches, gather people in a group and encourage them to have conversations. But I think for a lot of guys, that's, I know myself, I might go watch the videos, but I'm not going to be talking to this room of strangers. I don't know these people. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to start sharing. But I think it's a good first step. And I think that gives the church the opportunity to then offer a next step. Some churches have in-house counseling sessions or counseling services, like you mentioned, or they may refer you to someplace else where you can get low-cost counseling, either individually or in a group setting. So, and the church will obviously invite you to other groups or other programs that it has that can assist you, because churches want you to be in a community. They want you to be in a community of Christians. I think in general, churches have to look at divorce holistically. I mean, churches are all about strong marriages, but they have to be realistic. That, like I said, in the study that I referenced, many of the people who ended up getting divorced had every appearance of the strong Christian couple and the strong Christian family. And then, within 3 months after the appearance was given, then they were divorced or they were separated. You rarely hear from the pulpit anything about divorce except don't get one. God hates divorce. Those kind of simplistic messages. So I think that churches need to acknowledge that roughly 40% of the adults in the room have been through this or will go through this. I mean, it's a huge percentage. I think that they need to make it apparent that they want to talk to you, not just, after your wife leaves, but, our door is always open. If you're having problems, if you're having issues, if you are divorced, please come talk to us. That's why we're here. I think they need to include them in as many ways as they can. Not every small group needs to be a couple small group. You have to have other options. You have to give these people a place to go when they've gone through a divorce and they feel isolated as it is. Yes, divorce care is great, but that's a short-term triage kind of a thing. I mean, you're into this. What have you got for me now? I've been through divorce care. I want a community. I want some people I can talk to. So churches have to include or try to add those opportunities for people. Nobody wants to go to a divorced person's meeting. You can't call it that. I don't want to hang out with a bunch of divorced people, but I do want to feel included. And that, again, that's where men's groups are great, because men's groups don't typically care. We'd love to have single guys. We'd love to have divorced guys, widowers, married guys. Bring them all in. That's why we're here. We're here for men. So I think it's very open to that. But very few churches have a vibrant men's ministry. So I think it's kind of my soapbox, but that's that's the biggest thing I think churches can do, is get serious about your men, not just your divorced men, but all your men. What are you offering them now?
Hmm.
A burnt pancake breakfast, once a quarter, where we bring in a speaker and then we send you on your way and we don't meet again for another quarter. I mean, men need something that's going to build them up and it's going to carry them forward on a consistent basis. It can't be an occasional thing. It's a big investment and pastors are very overloaded. But like I said earlier, there are men in your church right now who would love to get something like this going and steer it and lead it.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit lucky. The church I attend, the guy who runs the Mittens Ministry, has a spreadsheet of every single man in the church, and he makes it his mission to make sure you're in a men's Bible study, whether you want to be or not. It's
Right. That's great.
So he will track you down and add you to his spreadsheet if you walk in on a Sunday morning. But
Now, is he on church staff or is he a
he's a
layman?
lay elder, so he's retired.
Yeah.
He's
So,
retired, and
yeah,
so it's like he makes it his
exactly.
mission to just full-time volunteer for the church, basically, doing different things like that. So
That is awesome. And that is all too uncommon. I mean, think about being a guy, retired guy, and, society has told you and other groups have told you that, well, your best days are over. Here's a guy stepping up to a role like this, and every church should have this guy, right? Or these guys. It gives them a mission. They're good at it. They're elders in many ways. They have wisdom. They have a caring heart. So it's not rocket science to solve this problem. It just takes the initiative and the follow through on the part of church leadership to get this going. They don't have to run it. They just have to find people who will and make sure they're doing it in a good way and let them loose.
all right, great. Well, that's basically all that I had today. Do you have any concluding thoughts before we wrap up? No pressure if not. Anything I didn't ask you about?
No, just like I said, I've got a heart for this because I've been through it and I've seen a lot of my close friends go through it. If you're not passionate about this as a man, then I know you're passionate about something. And there are other men out there who would benefit from your passion if it's directed in a way that will build other men up. So I guess I'm challenging men to be that guy in your church who gets something going or who adds fuel to a fire that's already started burning, that's going to build your men up.
Well, that's great. My guest today has been Chris Bolinger. He is the author of the devotional Daily Strength for Men. There's a link to get that in the show notes. There's a link to some pieces I wrote on divorce. I'm going to make sure all these pieces you referenced, certainly your infants, is it Crosswalk? The Sam, we'll get some link. I'll add that to the show notes. That's that in there right now. So there'll be plenty of resources for anybody who's looking for more stuff. You will find it. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Aaron. It was a pleasure.